Paul Dacre, Charles Moore, would they be two appointments you'd welcome, like Steve Baker?
Well, I think the whole idea of announcing appointments before a process has actually taken place is a bit strange. And I think the public will be wondering where the government's priorities are on this. Why are they worrying and interfering in an open process and appointment for BBC and Head of Ofcom, both two very senior, independent public service posts that carry significant salaries? Why are the government interfering in that sort of thing when they should be concentrating on getting a grip on test and trace, keeping coronavirus rates under control and getting the economy back on track?
You talked about process there, but how about the actual men themselves? Do you think Paul Dacre would be a good choice to be the chair of Ofcom?
I'm not going to comment on individuals being trailed as potential heads of the BBC or heads of Ofcom. You know, when an appointment is made and announced, we'll take a position and we'll take a view and comment on it then. But the fact is that, you know, the BBC and Ofcom are integral to our national interest. Ofcom regulates the BBC. They should be free from political interference. They should be impartial. And the stuff that's being trailed about these appointments is quite worrying.
OK. I understand you don't want to get drawn on commenting too much on the appointments. Paul Dacre once said that BBC journalism is reflected through a left-wing prism that affects everything it exercises, a kind of cultural Marxism. Do you think he's right?
I don't think he's right. I think if you look at the BBC, you will have people complaining that it's too left-wing in its presentation of political issues. You'll have people complaining that it's too right-wing. And the fact that they're both complaining suggests to me that it's probably got it somewhere right in the middle of it. And so the BBC is very important to us. You know, the BBC is what brings us together in times of national crisis. We've seen that during COVID. It helped educate children at home during Bite Size. It's incredibly important for our soft power abroad in terms of the world service, and it's something we should treasure. Now, I'm not saying it's perfect. No organisation is perfect, but if it goes, and if we don't have a BBC as we know it as an independent, impartial broadcaster, I think we'll really regret that.
OK. I'm keen to talk to you a little bit about the current situation with COVID-19 as well. So many people living now under local restrictions, local lockdowns. Sadiq Khan wants to tighten up things in London to stop people visiting each other's houses. Is that Labour's position now?
Well, there are local lockdowns all over the country. My constituency, Cardiff Central, our city, goes into lockdown at 6 o'clock this evening because of rising rates. You know, we have a public health crisis. Coronavirus rates are increasing. The test and trace system is broken. And
specifically on London, the question was specifically on London. I understand that there are millions of people living under local lockdowns too. Sadiq Khan says that he wants to tighten the restrictions in London. Is that Labour's position?
Well, if the evidence is that the rates are rising to a point where you need to have local lockdowns, then yes, you should have local lockdowns, and you take the scientific evidence and the medical evidence on that and make the decisions accordingly. But if you know, the whole point of these local lockdowns, they're happening because our test and trace system is not effective. And it's no good for the government to keep saying week after week in Prime Minister's questions and when ministers come to the dispatch box and painting this picture that everything is okay, because it isn't. The government needs to get a grip on test and trace and isolate. And if they can do that, it's in all our interests that that works. We can avoid increasing the number of local lockdowns that have to happen. And obviously, if there's a local lockdown in London, that affects significant numbers of people, much more than any city across the UK.
Without wanting to underplay the difficulties with test and trace, which have been very well documented, there is also a degree of personal responsibility, isn't there? Research out this week by King's College London showed only 10% of people asked to isolate when contacted by NHS Test and Trace actually did so. Only 18% of people with COVID-19 symptoms actually self-isolate. Are you worried that, well, frankly, people are being a bit selfish?
Well, I think that part of the reason why we're not seeing high levels of compliance comes back to the lack of clear communication from the government. You know,
it's pretty clear communication if NHS Test and Trace ring you up and say you should self-isolate and then you don't. 90% of people.
In those cases, if you are contacted and asked to self-isolate, you should self-isolate. You know, people should follow the guidance. But there's a lot of confusion out there, and we need three things to happen. We need test and trace to work effectively. We need to have sufficient testing capacity. We then need clear communication from government about what people need to do and when they need to do it, so that everybody can understand it, because it is very confusing. You know, that there are lots of people telling me every week in my constituency, and I hear it from my colleagues, that people aren't clear about what they are not and what they are allowed to do. And then we need to get the economy back on track, and we can't do that third thing unless those first two things happen.
OK, I'm talking about, clear direction, as you have been. I'm interested to get your thoughts on sporting events in particular, because, of course, we've seen the delay of live crowds going to sporting events. That's fine, of course, if you're a Premier League club, you've got lots of money through TV rights, but for struggling lower league clubs and lots of other sports as well, this could be, putting you at risk of going under because you're so reliant on ticket sales. What specifically needs to happen?
So we have been warning the government since the start of the summer that this was coming. I mean, this is not a surprise. We know that lower league clubs in football are completely reliant on ticket revenue. And this is no different from any other sector of the economy, where you need to have targeted support to the sectors that can't operate or can barely operate. Because if you've got something like lower league football, if you've got something like arts and culture and live entertainment, or the aviation industry or hospitality, if there's no income coming in, then there's not the money to pay salaries. So the government, rather than taking this one size fits all approach, is not working, and that's why the announcement this week from the Chancellor was so disappointing, because rather than target those specific sectors that need the help, he's taken a one size fits all approach again, and that's not going to work. That is going to help trigger mass unemployment like we have not seen since the 1980s. So we have been calling for months we've been calling for targeted support. The Premier League have actually said that they are ready to help. We are ready to help as a Labour Party, to help the government come up with a plan. We need to see a plan from the government about what they're going to do for sport. And this just doesn't affect football, as you say. This affects rugby, cricket, all sorts of sports. Because if we want to see these survive in 6 months' time, there needs to be some targeted, clear support and a plan now.
OK, now we've seen some pretty difficult stories recently about university students. It's a really hard time to be a young person, often away from home for the first time. You can't go to Freshers' Week in the same way that you would. Now you're told, many of them, that they have to self-isolate and that they may not even be able to go back to their families for Christmas. Should university students be allowed to return home at Christmas, even if it does risk spreading the virus?
We have to put safety and public health first, obviously, but we have said, Labour has said, we think that students should be allowed home at Christmas. And to enable them to do that, we need an effective test, trace and isolate system in place. Universities have worked incredibly hard to get universities ready across the country for the arrival of students this term, and particularly for freshers. And I know, as a parent of a student fresher, I know what parents and students are feeling at the moment, incredible levels of anxiety.
Are you worried about your own children coming home for Christmas then?
Well, I'm worried about the fact that students are, it's supposed to be a great time in your life. You go off to university, you're going to a new city to live, you're making new friends. They're missing out on all of that experience. And if we can get the test and trace and isolate system up and running effectively, that will allow students to be able to come home at Christmas to their families, which at the moment Matt Hancock refuses to say can happen. Now, I know that there are particular universities. Cardiff University, for example, in my constituency, is testing every single student and their staff on arrival at campus. Gavin Williamson should be talking to universities to make sure that they can all do that and put support in place for them to do that. And we need to see him come to the House of Commons tomorrow to tell us exactly what he's doing to help universities and help students through this, because we've had silence.
Okay. Now, we were speaking to Steve Baker earlier, who said that he's putting forward this amendment to allow Parliament to have a say before any new restrictions come in. He said that if the opposition parties support it, he's confident there'll be enough votes for that amendment to pass. So, yes or no would be absolutely fine. Will Labour support that amendment?
We have our own amendment, which we have tabled. It will depend which ones the Speaker selects for a debate and a vote. We have some sympathy with the amendment that Graham Brady has tabled, but we want to see something which our amendment sets out, which is about more transparency, about publishing the data behind decisions and a clear plan.
Just talking about a clear answer would be really... So if the Steve Baker amendment, the Graham Brady amendment, is selected, will Labour back it?
If it's selected, I think that the likelihood is that we would back it, but we would like to see our amendment debated and voted on. So let's see which one the Speaker goes for.